Hello and welcome to another edition of the Post-Council Meeting News Conference. We do this after every meeting of the Marshfield Common Council. Tonight we'll be recapping the meeting of December 20th as we end the year and move forward toward 2023. I'm joined by Mike Warren representing the Hub City Times. Mike, good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you.
And lead away.
All right, well, it was another interesting meeting. So interesting that I had not one, but two notepads. So let's just jump right in. For this one, I will start at the end. So I like to jump around and keep it interesting. So I'll go to the end of the agenda, which was, well, we're not going to cover everything. Staff report discussion on a possible referendum for public safety funding. And I have two notepads. One was from the Fire and Police Commission meeting the other day,
right.
And then one from the council. They go hand in hand because the commission talked about it, and then it kind of went to council level where they basically presented what the commission talked about. So what did the commission talk about? What was presented by you and others at council level, and what was the council's reaction?
Sure, Mike. Well, the commission had talked about the fact that just bringing back the 3 firefighter paramedics that were down from the last year, that we haven't replaced when they've left, is only going to get us back to where we were. But where we were, isn't really where we need to be. That's the assessment in terms of being able to provide the quality service that our ambulance, provides. So what the commission, after a lengthy discussion back on the 15th of December, came up with is 2 alternatives, and they're really pretty closely aligned. Number one is to hire 9 new firefighter paramedics. That's 3 per shift, okay, because they have 3 shifts.
Okay.
So 3 per shift, 9 total. Also, the police department hiring 1 police officer to refill, basically get them back to the full staff where they had been before. And then a couple of clerical positions. They would have a new record specialist in the police department based upon the fact that the growing number of reports that they need to deal with continues to increase. And then 1 shared position between the fire department and the police department for an administrative assistant, again, to keep up with the growing clerical duties of those departments. The second option is the same thing, except for the fact that it's only 6 firefighter paramedics initially, with the intent to go to 3 more for a total of 9 in 2025 or 2026. So it would end up at the same place ultimately. And both of these, Mike, would come with a 3% or something close to it escalator clause to reflect the consumer price index. So, what you hire a firefighter paramedic at in 2024, well, by the time it gets to 2025 and 2026 with increases in health insurance and wages and whatnot, you need to have a factor built in there to keep up with the cost of that very firefighter paramedic. So those are the 2 options, and they're more than was originally being talked about, but I think that their thought is that will move us forward and prepare us really for the latter part of this decade and beyond.
So the first thing I'm hearing is that the fire department in particular is understaffed.
Yeah, the fire and EMS operation together. And really, when we talk about fire and EMS, it's the ambulance side of the coin that has the most calls. They're going to top 4,000 calls this year in that department. And the vast majority of them are for ambulance service, about 92%. Roughly 92% of our calls are ambulance and 8% are fire related. So keeping up with that volume is getting challenging.
All right. So what's on the table here? I understand that there were 2 different options being looked at, and that the council on the 20th, they decided nothing, and it goes to the next. Well, I guess they did decide something.
They did and they didn't. I mean, I kind of thought they might say, okay, number 1 has some merit, number 2 has some merit. Here's maybe a number 3 we'd like to talk about. They could have done anything they wanted to on the 20th, but what they really did, they endorsed number 1 and number 2 options that came from the Fire and Police Commission and said, let's put this on the agenda for January 10th in a ballot question. And the ballot question has to be very specific by law. Should the city of Marshfield be permitted to increase the levy for fire and police services as follows? And it'll have to say the amount specifically, and that'll tie to tax increases. Basically, the public would be increasing their own taxes to cover the additional services. And the argument is, and it's been made in cities all across Wisconsin in the last couple of months in other referendums, is that this is public safety and this is necessary to keep pace with costs.
If we do, there are 2 options. One calls for 9 additional staff members at the fire department. one police officer, a records specialist at the police department,
Right.
which would replace somebody who's retiring.
Correct.
So that's a wash from a dollar standpoint. And then one shared admin between the police and fire departments.
Right. Presumably 50-50 between those two departments to help with clerical and administrative duties.
1.2 million total, $85.50 per $100,000 of property value would be the impact.
Correct. Correct. And, you talk about value of homes. We always used to say, what's the impact on a $100,000 home? Well, $100,000, as the world has changed. So I think they shared with 100, 150, and 200,000. So for a $200,000 home, it would be about $171, I think, per year.
Okay.
And it looks like, unless the council changes direction, Mike, on January 10th, that one of these two ballot questions will be potentially put out on April 4th to the city's voters.
Yeah, there is a second option being looked at, which would be $62.83 per $100,000, $905,000 total, right?
Right.
And that would be six initially, and then
Correct.
adding three
And three
firefighters over
later.
the course of a year or two.
Yeah, and that's a little bit undefined right now. I mean, they talked about this won't go into effect into 2024. Nothing's going to happen for 2023. It's already the 1st of January here shortly. But the intent would be 2024 is when that first piece kicks in, and then the idea of elevating to 9 total firefighters would be in 25 or 26. But we'll have to look at the ballot question if they choose that one. How to word it? Is it airtight? Do they nail down a certain year? That one will have to be debated if they pick option number 2.
It's interesting to note that if we do the first option, which is everything that the departments are asking for, that gets us basically to where we should be. Well, from what I mean, if you bring in some certain standards, we'll never get to where we need to be. But this would get us back to where really we should be for a city our size.
That is the assertion being made, yes. And I'm not really up on the standards, but that's what's being said to me as well. This will put us in a good place for the future as to what our staffing levels really should be, Mike.
Okay. And it would help, according to the fire chief, it would help with insurance rates, would reduce staff stress and burnout. I'm just going off some of my notes I took during the council meeting. Put Marshfield, more in line with cities. He kind of compared us to Rapids and Point and Wausau. And we'd be more comparable. And as far as the police department, we're at 2 to 2.5 officers per 1,000 people, which is that's the goal. We would be at that. Right now we're at 2.1 to 2.2. But he said, keep in mind our population increases every day when all those workers come into town and all those patients come into town and things of this nature. And even at night when people come in for, nightlife types of things from neighboring communities. So there's a lot at play here. But it sounds like there is an appetite for that, let's do everything at once. Yeah,
I agree. And playing off your comment there, I've been told that during the daytime, our population goes from roughly 20,000 to close to 30,000, just from the employment, the people who work at the clinic, the people who are here for their employment and other things. It's a big jump. So you're talking about more than 20,000 people during the day. And I think you're assessing this very well. I think that's correct. I think under normal circumstances, referendums are very hard to sell to the public. How many people want to voluntarily increase their own taxes? But they've been getting these passed across the state because of the fact they tie specifically to public safety, and people look at things like police and fire and ambulance as really high priority items.
Well, I guess my question would be, why do we need a referendum? Why can't we just fund this through normal budgets?
Well, we could. I mean, the problem with that is, blowing through the levy limits of the state. We really push the levy limit. People don't realize this because our tax increase this year at the city level is only 0.7%. But because of our lack of net new construction value that the city allows us to raise the levy for, we really had very little room to raise the levy. We couldn't have gone any farther than we did. So the only way that the state allows you to go beyond the levy limits is if you do a referendum. The voluntary support of the citizens beyond what the levy limits call for.
Okay. It's kind of a state problem.
It is. It's kind of funny. I don't mean to complain, but the state is very tight on property taxes. I sometimes wonder why they're concerned about whether Marshfield wants to have a different property tax rate than Point, for example. What if we want to have a greater level of services, or they want to have a greater level of services? But for better or for worse, I think state officials, legislators, feel like they're judged on what the property taxes are in their state, and they've adopted levy limits to try to control that.
So January 10th, it's a do or die, right? It's a yes, we're going to move forward with this, or no, we're not, because there is a time, there's a certain time that taxing entities have
Right.
to publish referendums. In other words, I think it's 45 days or something before the election day.
Yeah.
You got to publish all the documents, you got to get material out there to voters, you got to get questions on ballot, things of this nature. I mean, they need so much lead time to get these ballots set. So it's
Right.
January 10th is the next meeting, and that's yay or nay, thumbs up or thumbs down. And if that's the day it gets approved or doesn't.
It does. I suppose it's possible, Mike, for the council to schedule a special meeting 2 days later on January 12th. But if you look at the regular council schedule, we need to adopt this by January 10th in order to meet the deadlines for getting on the April 4th ballot.
Big news, we're looking at possibly two referendums then, one for the city, one for the school district. They're looking at one now too, and they vote shortly after the council on whether they're going to have a referendum on the April ballot or not. It looks pretty favorable at this point that they will, so us a big April election coming up, or not even election really, more so about a referendum or referendums than anything.
Right, and Mike, normally taxing jurisdictions don't do this. If we find out that somebody else is doing it, the county or the school district, we normally wait till another time because you don't normally like to conflict. I think what both groups are saying is we need this. I mean, we need to move forward, and they probably both respect the fact that the other has a pressing need too, but just can't wait. There won't be another election until 2024 after April 4th. So if you have needs that you feel need to be funded, this is your moment.
Oh, okay. I will get my request in. I've got some
Oh,
needs.
you personally?
Yes, I've got some.
Maybe some home repairs
Some
and stuff?
CIP needs at home that need addressing, so there will be a third.
I can see that.
There'll be a third
roofing,
referendum question coming forward.
Roofing, landscaping, whatever you got
for
going.
for Mike Warren's
Absolutely.
slush fund. Or
Bring it
whatever.
on. I'll get it right. I'll get it right to the committee, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure that'll go nowhere, but
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple other items we want to get to here in the time we have left. I'll go to another one on the agenda, and I'm kind of working backwards if people are following their agendas at home, which you should be, right?
Right.
Discuss appointing committee to review proposed ordinance number 1485 and to review the structure of the Utilities Commission. This was presented by Alderman Adam Fisher at the council meeting.
Yep.
Can you follow up on that one?
I can. If you remember back on December 13th, a week earlier, there was an hour and 20-minute conversation about this. And a lot of things were discussed, and it was a good conversation. But ultimately, Adam Fisher said, let's bring this to the next meeting, and I want two things to be looked at. One is forming a committee. Well, they're all wrapped up into this one. The committee will look at both the ordinance, which involves the financing, meaning, if you read between the lines, can the city get access to excess revenues from the utilities to come into the general coffers? And number two is, right now there are no members of the council on the Utilities Commission. We have two council members who attend the meetings, but they have no formal status at all. They're not even ex officio. They just go there because they want to keep up on what's happening. So would we allow council to be represented and possibly voting members of that body? So the thought Adam had was, and I agree with him totally, let's get this away from the meeting. We could talk another hour and 20 minutes about, well, what are the revenues over there in the utilities? Now, how much do they have to keep for the PSC requirements? Well, let's take a look at this. That's not generally the conversation you want to have at a public meeting. You want to, when you meet, you want to have all the information in front of you and say, okay, I've read it ahead of time. Here's what it looks like. Here's how I vote, or here's what I want to do. We don't have that right now. We have the assertion being made that perhaps there's excess revenues from Marshfield Utilities, from their electric and water service, that could be funneled over to the city to help offset our budget issues. Yeah. And we have utilities saying, you don't understand the whole thing, guys. We're required to keep all these reserve funds for different purposes by the PSC, by other authorities, by bond council, to support our borrowings. It's not what you see. So the idea is, let's get a separate committee, and Adam requested, and the council agreed, that there'll be members of the city, and members of the utilities side of the thing. And I think ultimately, I'm just speaking for myself here, Mike, we're going to have to get professional help. Somebody from the finance world to look at this and say, okay, I need to dig into all of it, give me all the information, and I will tell you what I see in terms of, is there really excess revenue that could be shared, and does state law allow for that to be shared? But we'll get it out of the council meetings. Decisions aren't going to be reached in the council chambers because you need information. So I would expect to see this go on now for the first quarter of 2023, and hopefully we'll come back later in the quarter with some ideas as to where we stand.
Yeah, Alderman Fisher was as he was sort of presenting this to the council, was saying, I'm kind of paraphrasing some of his comments, but council members don't feel involved, in kind of what's going on at the utilities. Yeah, even though the members of the commission and I think one of the concerns is they're not elected.
Correct, it is.
Commission members are appointed by the council.
Correct.
So that's really their only involvement in some of this.
Yep.
And so he was asking, is this the perfect structure? Could or should council members be involved? To what extent? Do we disband the current Utilities Commission altogether? Just get rid of it and have the utility report to another existing committee, maybe Board of Public Works,
Yep.
or I think it was Finance and Budget was mentioned. And those were some of his thoughts, and I think he's particularly interested in the fiscal part of this, the control
Yep.
of the money. The utility sits on a lot of reserves. And that's the other thing. Reserves versus profit is what
Right.
he said, and there are some questions there too. So there's a lot to answer.
Yeah, and the city doesn't have exactly the same situation as Marshall Utilities, but we do have our auditors saying that they want 25 to 30% of our general fund reserves tucked away and not touched. That's call it rainy day fund, call it what happens if disaster hits, whatever. But so you could look at it and say, well, the city of Marshfield has X million dollars. Well, we would tell you right off that a fair chunk of that is off limits. Maybe not legally off limits, but we've been told that good practice is to retain it. So we need to dig in and find out what all these different balances are and whether or not there are monies that truthfully could be and should be sent over to the city. But there's a lot of questions. The whole thing about PSC rules and everything else is up for grabs. As far as who's on the committee or on the commission, right now it's a 5-member commission, 5-year terms. So one time a year in September, you've seen this before, we elect a new member. And it might be a reappointment, but every year in September, somebody's up. And so if we went to having council members beyond the commission, what would it look like? Would we expand from 5 to 7 and say 5 citizens and 2 council? Would we say 5 citizens, we stay with 5 people, but when the next one comes up, rather than reappointing a citizen, we get a council member on? So by the fall of 2023, we have 5 members, of which 1 is on the council. If we get council as a voting member of this body, what would that look like, and when would it happen? So there's a lot of questions, and hopefully out of this will come a deeper understanding of the utilities finances, and hopefully a closer relationship between the council and the commission.
Well, and then the other question Alderman Witzel was bringing up, as part of this discussion, let's make sure that the existing ordinance is being followed. What are we doing? Are we doing now what we're supposed to be doing? Before we change anything, let's make sure when I heard that comment, I first kind of reacted going, okay, wouldn't the city attorney make sure you're following the existing ordinance as you kind of go? I don't know how that all works, but who's in charge of making sure you're following the rules as you go along here with this ordinance and with any ordinance, really, right?
Right. A lot of the focus with Ordinance 1485 that's been proposed is on that last part, the piece that seems to open the door to the city being able to take dollars from the utilities for general operations. But the other parts of it, Mike, if you look at it, talk about the mechanics of how we do business and what's required of the utilities in terms of paying creditors and what involvement does city staff have in terms of some of those records. And there have been questions raised as to whether we're following the exact letter of what's called out. And and we're going to get that corrected too. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong, there's been any mismanagement or anything like that, but over time you get new finance directors, new finance staff, new city administrators, new whatever. And if you're not watching, you might be not following A, B, C, D exactly in terms of what it technically calls for the process. So we'll go back and make sure if there's anything that's not being done that way right now, that we get it corrected so that whatever oversight we need here at the city level is provided to the detail. But again, I want to remind people, if you're hearing this, you're thinking, oh my gosh, you've been closing your eyes and closing your ears. That's not been happening. But you don't look at these provisions very often, and you want to make sure that we are not just doing A and B, but we're doing C and D as well along the way to make sure that we are doing our due diligence.
So the council did vote, I think, 8-2 I had down here to do a special, was it a special? Committee?
Yep.
Okay.
Made up of utilities and city representatives, and the part what I mentioned about there being an outside financial advisor, that's just Steve Barg, okay? Nobody said that. I just think at some point in the process it would be helpful for us to get somebody from the financial world who's not part of either organization, not part of the utilities or part of the city proper, to weigh in and say, well, here's what I think is reasonable in terms of their reserves, and here's why. But right at first, we'll just start out with probably the people we just named, the people from utilities and the city getting together and really kind of laying out the issues initially.
Yeah, and two public works members of
Right.
that board, 2 finance, and then 4 staff.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. 8-2 was the vote. Alderman Mike Fire and Pete Handler voted no.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on that one?
Not on that one, no, I don't
Okay.
think so.
So then the last one we wanted to talk about was a request to appoint a team to review the city's organizational chart and to study possible restructuring opportunities. This was presented by you at the council level. What are we looking at here?
Well, Adam Fisher brought this up in late October. I think it was at the end of a meeting under items for future agendas. Said, have we looked at our org chart in a long time? And we don't talk about your org chart very often, but you can see who reports to who, how many direct reports do people have? Does the city administrator have too many people reporting to him? Does the public works director have too many people reporting to him? Wouldn't it make more sense if we put the building division under Public Works instead of Development Services? All these kind of things. I'm making it up as I go along. I'm good at that. Yeah. But the reality is, let's look at the org chart and see if there's efficiencies we can gain in our city operations. So that's been hanging out there for a little while, but I've kind of been waiting to call this group together for a little bit until we saw where things are going with the Development Services Department. We had one more post in November trying to get people for the positions of Development Services Director and City Planner. Came up empty for the 4th time. And so what we're going to look at, what this group is going to look at first and foremost, Mike, right away, like probably the first week in January, I'm going to have them together. The first job before they look at the broad org chart is to look at the org chart specifically of Development Services. We've had people who were good at economic development, but they didn't have the planning background, so we didn't pick them for the director. We had a person who was good on the planning side, but didn't have economic development background. The question is, are we looking for too much, or do we look at splitting it? Do we look at reconfiguring planning, economic development, building inspection in some way that maybe we're more likely to get the candidates we want and have a structure that makes sense? I mean, we've had this structure for a long time. Maybe there's another way to cut the pie and be able to be more effective. So we'll start with that, but then we'll get into the bigger thing very soon after that about the broader org chart. And I know there have been concerns before raised about whether too many people report directly to me and whether or not certain divisions belong under certain departments. We'll get into that rather quickly.
Okay, so that'll be an ongoing thing. There's no time limit put on it. They'll get together eventually in the first, after the first of the year or something, and then they'll take things as they come, and with no end in sight, really. I mean, there's not a sunset on this thing that by March or April or May we're going to be doing this and making these changes.
No and yes. I mean, I think no in the broad sense, but I think in terms of the Development Services Department, there's going to be a real sense of urgency. We've gone without a director since March. We've gone without an associate planner since May. We've gone out without a city planner since October. We're contracting with a firm out of the Milwaukee area to provide basic planning related services, and we're paying the hourly rate. So I think that one will have a tremendous urgency of trying to figure out, do we get another consulting firm? Do we post again? Do we carve the pie differently so that we have different job titles and different duties? Beyond that, I think, Mike, the rest of it may take a while to unfold.
All right. In the couple minutes we have left, maybe we can just, there was one other agenda item. I don't know if there's anything to it, but staff report review agreements from municipalities that contract with private companies for ambulance services. What was that discussion?
Well, there's a lot of irony, and I've had people tell me this about that item being right after the item on the referendum.
Right.
But Mike O'Reilly a couple weeks ago said, we never really looked at privatization of our ambulance service. We talked about it, but we didn't go very deep. And he requested at the end of a previous council meeting to get copies presented to the council at a meeting and touched on at least as to what other cities do. Do other cities have private contracts where you contract with Gold Cross or one of those firms for service? So I looked for him, and I came back and I brought two that I found, one from the city of River Falls and one from the city of Waupaca, that do contract with private ambulance services, where they pay, in the case of Waupaca, they pay Gold Cross a set, we pay you this much, and then you provide service, and then the customers will be billed independently. So as far as Mike Warren or Steve Barg, if we lived in Waupaca, getting a bill for the ambulance, Waupaca's out of it. That's between Gold Cross and the customer. But the city has to pay, like the town of McMillan and others pay the city of Marshfield now, pay a flat rate every year to be covered, to know that if someone calls from your community, someone's going to respond. And so I presented these. He looked at them. I found two more today that I sent his way. I'm forgetting the communities that they were. I think one was Hudson, and the other one was over in the Green Bay area, I think. And he's just looking at them. He's interested. He's trying to figure out if there are any benefits. And if we're not changing to a private carrier, maybe there's provisions in those agreements that we can learn from. Maybe we find out that things are being billed in a way that, hey, maybe the city of Marshfield could bill like this and have a better collection rate. So he's hoping that there'll be something in there that's beneficial.
Yeah, why reinvent the wheel, right?
Right. Very true.
There is, as we wind down 2022, there is a lot that we, I almost said discovered, but there's a lot that came up in 2022. There will be a lot of that carries over into 2023, and we will not have a shortage of things to talk about.
We won't. And truly, I think the big three things to start out the year, as far as I'm concerned, we've talked about today. The utilities issue with their excess revenue, if there indeed is excess revenue, the referendum for public safety, and the staffing issue where we really don't have anybody in the planning and economic development area on staff right now. I would say for your first quarter, Mike, those are the key issues.
Yeah, and it's not like you can, move somebody up because then you create vacancies. You know what I mean? You can't promote from within, and then now you've got another problem. So
no, and we're not alone. Other cities across the state are having trouble finding planning staff, which is comforting, but it doesn't ultimately help.
Okay. Well, see you next year.
Sounds good, Mike. Okay. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to all of you for tuning in to the post-council meeting news conference. We do this again after every meeting of the Marshfield Common Council and get you caught up to date. What are the decisions? What are the next steps? And we're glad to have you with us. So I want to thank Mike Warren, representing the Hub City Times, for his insightful questions, and I want to thank you for tuning in again. Have a great Christmas and New Year's, and we'll see you in 2023 on the post-council meeting news conference.